All right, welcome everybody. So today's session, this is the Heartland webinar series, the Heartland Success Series webinar. And we are today talking about fair housing, antitrust, and maybe a couple little segments around that. Excuse me. So I do want to start with this one. I talked a little bit about this already this morning with another group of people, but I do want to just cover it again just briefly here. I think it's good information, legal and liability. First, of course, my disclosure, I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice. This is just Jim Heisler's opinion based on my 24 and a half years of real estate experience in the industry, knowledge, training, all the stuff I've gone through. So my guess, my opinion, my take on some of these topics. All right, so if you're standing in front of a judge, how do you defend yourself? I think that needs to be almost in the forefront of your mind as you're doing real estate. So when you're out in the business world, when you're interacting with clients, you need to be taking, I say, steps beyond just what license law requires. So best practices. We're going to cover a couple of those, especially I'm going to give you a really good best practices when we get to dual agency, which we're going to cover in just a couple minutes here. So just think about what can you do to put yourself in a better defendable position. If you were standing in front of a judge, if someone was suing you, if you were a defendant in a lawsuit, what would be the better thing for you to have done than what the law required or than what you did? So we talked about referrals. So when you're giving out the name of an attorney, a lender, or a home inspector, that you're going to give out more than one name. You can use Heartland's list from our website, print those off. And you guys can't see my screen. That might help. Technology. Okay, there we go. So you're printing off the list. You want to give them a copy list and say, here's the attorney I recommend, here's why I recommend it, but here's others on the page as well, in case you're interested in contacting someone else. Was there an attorney that you had in mind that you might want to use for this transaction? And ask them that way. And then make your comments about that. That's a better position than handing them one business card with one name on it. And then if the attorney did a bad job for whatever reason, the client sues you and the attorney, of course, but you gave the recommendation of that attorney. If you gave them just the one business card, that's a less defendable position than if you'd handed them a list and circled the one or two or three names of people that you would recommend that they use. So again, go ahead, use that recommendation, use those lists. That's what they're there for. Heartland has about 175 different affiliate members. Of course, we have a lot in the radon field because the key cards, the home inspectors as well, lenders, attorneys, and the whole list that we have on our website. So please use that. And then the other one I think that you should look at is something that I've always used. So this is the one I used when I was in real estate. If this were in the headline of the newspaper, would it look good for you? And then here at Heartland, I twist that a little bit. If our members knew we were doing this, what would they think? So same kind of a thing. If our members knew we were going to give away, something to a certain group of people, what would they think? That's a good decision-making process. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just, does it make sense? How do you defend that? How do you rationalize it? So if it were in the headline in the newspaper, how would it look? So I think of, again, the buyer agency agreement. So if you're using a buyer agency agreement and your client does end up buying a property through another person or a for sale by owner or some other means and not you, do you want to sue your client for that commission? I mean, technically you probably can. That's probably what that form says. Not an attorney, can't give you a legal opinion, but that's probably what it allows you to do, to sue that client for the commission. But think of the headline, agent sues client for commission. And then think of what that story would look like. Is that good for your firm? Is that good for you? Are you going to look good in that? Or are you going to lose more deals because of that one deal than you would have if you'd not gone after the client? So again, not tell you if you should or shouldn't sue, because in some cases you absolutely should, but not always. So just think about how your actions are going to affect you, what they're going to look like, how they're going to be perceived sometimes. Office policy manual. So what things, this kind of makes us think of ethics. Of course, we have the code of ethics and license law. So that's the third one down. Code of ethics and license law have things that you have to do, you have to abide by. But then you also have the office policy manual. So your office, all offices are required by the state to have a policy manual. All agents should have a copy of it. You know, I'm not a managing broker of an office, but if I were, I'd probably have mine online because it would probably be tweaked here or there or whatever. I wouldn't go in and do it daily, of course. If there are changes, I want to get all the changes out to my agents so that they're aware of what changed in it. But I'd certainly have it online so that they can have access to it easily. Or if it was printed, that's fine, but I would give them a handwritten copy of it, you know, a printed, a hard copy of it. Because the broker, the managing broker, does have the ability, the legal right, to use that as their defense. If an agent doesn't follow something in the office policy manual, the managing broker can go to court so they can stand in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, it's in our office policy manual, it's been in the office policy manual. They should probably speak to training on that as well and how they've trained on it and why the agent should have known about it. That would be helpful for them. But they do have the ability to say it's in the office policy manual, everyone received a copy of it, and all agents have to follow it. That is a defendable position. Good or bad, there's weaknesses to some of that. And then individual morals. Of course, we all come into the real estate business, into our lives. We wake up every day. We have morals and ethical conduct that we think is normal and how we should behave. And we need to abide by that. So lots of things going on that you need to think about. Managing agency relationships in Illinois. Let's talk just briefly about this. I know most of you get the buyer agency and the seller agency, but let's talk briefly about buyer agency agreements. So who is your client? Who do you work for? Many years ago, I think it was January 1st of 1995, if I've got my history right, so a long time ago, the license law changed, sub-agency was diminished. Some would argue it went away, it didn't fully go away, but it's not practiced like it was then. And you are not everyone is the agent of the seller as it used to be. So you are working for your client is the person you're working for is presumed in Illinois. And now there's asterisks on that, but it's presumed in Illinois. So who do you work for? Buyer agency, clearly if you're working with the buyer client, the buyer is your client, you need to be working in their best interest. What if you're going to use a buyer agency agreement? So you need to talk with your managing broker of the office first to see if they allow, if they use them. And if so, what the conversation should be. I would suggest all new agents, I know we have a lot on the call today, that you have a conversation with your managing broker about what do you say with the buyer agency agreement? What conversation do you have with your client to get them to sign it? I think there's a fear that some agents have, well, they're not going to want to sign it. I signed one. I was 24 years old looking to buy a property. I went to a real estate agent. It was right before I got my real estate license. And she had asked me to sign one. I said, sure, I have no problem with that. Now, she was a Wakanda agent. I was looking at both Vernon Hills and Wakanda. And I said, and she said to me that she doesn't really know the market in Vernon Hills and Mundelein, Libertyville. And I said, well, great. I've got no problem signing this with you for Wakanda. We buy a property. If I'm interested in property Wakanda, I have no issue with that. But if you're not really comfortable with Vernon Hills, Mundelein, Libertyville, then I don't think that's fair. So we adapted it, added in Wakanda only for that buyer agency agreement, and she was taking care of me. Now I ended up buying a property in Vernon Hills. Did she get paid a commission? She did. Do you know why? Because I still used her. I still felt a loyalty to her. I had called her up and said, hey, I've got a property in Vernon Hills I'm interested in. Are you able to show this to me? She ran over to show it to me, and I ended up buying that property. So I think of that buyer agency agreement as really a contract of loyalty. But keep in mind, it's not just their loyalty to you, it's also equally your loyalty to them. You are just as much a part of that agreement as they are. They have to be loyal to you in that any real estate transaction they're interested in needs to come through you, or if they buy it somewhere else, then likely you're entitled to a commission. Again, depending on what the wording of it is, and I'm not an attorney. But similarly, you need to be available to them almost 24/7. So anything they need real estate-wise, you need to provide that to them. So again, you can pull an asterisk on that response, but in theory, 24/7, you need to provide them all services. So you need to be just as loyal to them as they are to you. If they want to go see property on your day off, you better figure out a way for them to be able to see that property. For you to just simply say, it's my day off, I can't do it. Now you've really broken that agreement, in my opinion, and I'm not an attorney. So buyer agency agreements. Seller agency, that's a little simpler, right? Everyone's going to have, you better have a listing agreement with your client. So get the listing side signed. But I want to spend a little time on dual agency before we get to a couple of these other topics. Dual agency and best practices. So what the law requires and what you might want to do are two different things. So the law simply says that when you're working in dual agency, both parties have to know it and acknowledge it prior to signing the contract. Paraphrasing. I think it's better if you take a couple of extra steps. So you obviously you have the listing first. So you're taking the listing, you're sitting out the sellers, you're getting them to sign the paperwork, you have a conversation about dual agency, you go through all of that. And again, for new agents on the phone, you need to talk with your managing broker or your mentor or whoever about what these conversations are. You don't want to have to practice these your first time that you're in front of a seller. You want to be able to practice this, do some role playing ahead of time so that you're smooth and confident when you're sitting in front of a client. So have those conversations, go through the dual agency conversation, have the client sign off initial if they are in agreement. Obviously, if they're not in agreement to dual agency, then that's fine too. They're allowed that opinion. But let's assume they are okay with dual agency. Now you start advertising the home. You have clients calling you about the property, and someone reaches out to you that's interested in it because of advertising that you've done. You're on the phone with them, you explain to them that, so of course you realize I'm the listing agent on the property, so this is what we call dual agency. It's perfectly legal in Illinois, but I just need to have your approval that I would work for both parties, and just as I've gotten their approval that it's okay for me to work with both parties. So you go through that, and you're gonna say it better than I just did. You get their approval, you go meet with them to go show the property. Before you do that, I suggest you call the seller and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, yeah, it's Jim, your agent, right? Remember that conversation we had about dual agency last week or last night or last month? Whatever it is, I'm sure you don't remember in detail. Let me just go over that again with you briefly. That's what I would say. That's your best practices. Not required by law, being clear. Law would say sign the contract, have them reaffirm it on the contract. I suggest you reaffirm with them prior to, so you don't find yourself a contract and now that somebody wants to get out of dual agency and you're in a conundrum because you've already done it. So again, not required, best practice. I can't stress that enough. Call the seller, have the conversation. Great, remember that conversation? You probably don't. Let me just go over that again. You have the conversation, explain dual agency. I'm gonna send you an email in just a minute that's gonna be a disclosure for you. I just need your approval if that's okay for me to go ahead and show this property to these buyers. Great, thanks. And you send it off, you get it back, you go show the property and go forward. That's best practices. That's where you're best protecting yourself, standing in front of a judge. What could you have done better? That's the kind of situation you could have done better than just going by the law alone. I'm not saying the other way without it is illegal, it's not. But if something goes wrong, if someone says, oh, he never had that conversation, or he didn't explain that to me, you know, you've got the disclosure signed twice, once on a listing agreement, and then secondly, right before you re-showed it. I mean, that's a really defendable position. So I'm gonna check the chat box, which went away again. If you guys could use chat box and not the Q&A, that would be helpful. I'm gonna bring up the chat box here if I can find it. It went away. Ashley, go ahead and ask your question, I think.
No, I bumped the key. Sorry about that.
No problem. I was hoping you had a question.
No, sorry.
There's something in chat and I can't, it won't come up for you. Dang it. Okay. Well, I don't know what the question was. So if someone has, the chat box is not showing for me. So if someone has a question they want to ask, please unmute yourself and jump in. I think, there we go, getting a few other people.
Yeah, hi, this is Scott. Can you hear me?
Yes, Scott, go ahead.
So you're saying email is notice for that seller agency?
So yeah, so email for the buyer for the dual agency agreement. So in this case, it would be reconfirmation of dual agency. They've already signed it once at your listing appointment because you definitely need it and want to get it done there. But then prior to actually performing the activities of a dual agent, I would recommend to you, best practices, that you reconfirm with your client they are okay with dual agency. Because what if their mind has changed, which it could, and they're entitled to, if their mind has changed prior to you entering into dual agency with the buyer client, this gives them the option to reconfirm. It's not required. You could have gone forward, you could have shown the property, but I think you're better off to, you know, again, protect yourself, stand in front of a judge. And dual agency is a touchy situation. I'll just be real clear and say that the state, meaning IDFPR, a couple of years ago was really going after dual agency, and the director at that time had clearly made it well known, was very vocal about he disliked dual agency, and if he had his way, it would have been outlawed, illegal. So it did not go away, but I think we have more of a responsibility to make sure that we're careful in how that's presented to our clients, so that the seller and the buyer both are clearly aware that you are representing both sides, and that you have to pull back out of the transaction a little bit. You cannot work with both of them to negotiate. How can you get the buyer the best deal while you're getting the seller the best deal? There's just no way to do that. So an email reconfirmation would absolutely be effective as proof of, I had this conversation, Your Honor. It was right before the showing. It was the night before. I called them. We had the conversation. I then sent him the email. He followed up, they followed up with the email. They confirmed it and sent it back to me, and here's the form. I think that's phenomenal. I mean, how is a judge going to argue with that? How is the defendant or the plaintiff going to argue with that? So hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yep. And I can get every other box except the chat box to come up. I don't know what the problem is. Technology. We're moving on. Disclosed dual agency. So that's that one, best practices. Moving forward. Oh, next slide.
When you put the mouse down at the bottom of the screen, does it give you that chat option?
It's
down
not
there?
the bottom, it's the top now because I've got that up. And I can get the Q&A to come up. I can get my participants to come up. I can't get the chat box to come up. And they even asked me about the chat. It showed that somebody had said something. Alt-H.
My chat is at the bottom of the screen.
Alt-H is, well, it might be hidden underneath my slide is what I'm afraid of. Anyway, I'm moving forward. So best practices, we're good. And now I'm just gonna slide, there we go. So minimum services, agency in Illinois does require minimum services. That has not changed. The license law, as you know, did get readopted. It was an odd time. It was supposed to be December 31st, but instead it went to effect August 9th because we forgot to put in the clause that says this goes into effect December 31st. But anyway, the point is that minimum services in Illinois did not change. So answer, assist, and accept. All agents must help their clients with real estate. And agents can't waive this. Sellers can't waive this fully. They can sort of waive this, but they still must be available to answer, assist, and accept offers. So if a seller has a firm working, representing them, and an offer comes in, they must be available to answer, assist, and accept those offers and help the client out with that. Confidential information. So let's open this up. And again, anyone who wants to jump in can unmute themselves. So there are several situations when confidential information ceases to be confidential. So who would like to jump in and give me one example of when confidential ceases to be confidential?
I'm going to say if a listing agent tells you something that was supposed to be confidential with their client, their customer,
So
then I can
absolutely.
tell mine.
Absolutely. You're the buyer's agent. The listing agent says something they shouldn't have told you. You have an obligation to explain that to your buyer. Absolutely. That's not confidential in your hands. That should have been in their hands. But in your hands, it's not. And in fact, you have an obligation to tell your client the information you've gotten, so long as it wasn't confidential in the way you received it, which it would not have been. Where that may have changed is if you had been the listing agent of the property that your buyer is now interested in. Say you had the listing, and while you had the home listed, obviously you knew the sellers and you talked to the sellers and maybe you knew their bottom line. That was all confidential information. Let's pretend that the listing expired or canceled. You no longer have the listing, someone else has listed it. You're now working with the buyer on it. You can't tell them what you know about the seller's position because that was confidential when you received it. But your situation, what you said was, you received the information from the listing agent. Absolutely. When you received that, that was not confidential to you. The agent should have kept it confidential, but once you got it, you now have an obligation to tell your clients about it. Absolutely. Who else has got another one? There's several. That wasn't one of my examples.
I have one, Jim.
Yep.
This is a really wild one, but
Uh-oh.
suppose I'm representing the seller, and the seller tells me that he thinks this house is haunted.
We're going to get to stigmatized in a second. So you said something that's a correct answer. So I'm going to go with that, and then we're going to get to stigmatized in a second. So we're going to cover that in just a moment. Great, Daryl. 2 points. You said, though, the seller told you. So let's go with that one. Confidential information ceases to be confidential if the seller gives you permission to disclose it. So situation could be like the one I had. I had a client who was looking for a property. I'll save you all the details, but she couldn't afford the property she wanted. So she was about $5,000 short of really being able to afford what the home was worth. She knew it was worth what they were asking and what they wanted. I knew it was, but it really wasn't there. I looked at her and said, Lisa, here's what I'd like to do. Now, in this case, I had her write the letter, so it really wasn't me divulging, but I said, Lisa, why don't you write a letter and explain the situation, why you love this home? Because the fact is, her father and mother lived kitty corner behind the house, so the properties touched each other. She went to school at the school that's right down the block. She grew up in that neighborhood. She wanted to live in that neighborhood. She just couldn't afford the neighborhood. A single mom with 3 kids. I said, Lisa, you write up your story. We'll present this over the other side, and we'll see what that does for you. So we did that. What do you think happened? Seller was only too happy to sell her the home for the $5,000 less. Glad that someone's going to come into the home and love the home as much as they love the home, that knew the area, knew the thing. I would guess that the owners of that, the sellers probably even knew the parents, right? But so that was Lisa's confidential information. I asked her to divulge that. So that was that kind of a situation. When's another time when confidential ceases to be confidential? We talked about it already a little bit. We talked about the courts. So court order. So if a court orders you to divulge the information, then first you're going to contact an attorney before you do anything. You're not going to just roll over and give it up. You're going to contact an attorney and make sure that legally you're doing what you have to do. But court order would be one of the reasons. And then the last one, anyone have the last one? Give you a second.
Well, I think when it's public record, public
Yes, sir.
knowledge.
Bingo. So when the information becomes public record. So let's use a divorce. So you have Brad, Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston as your clients, and you know before the entire world knows that they're about to get a divorce. Obviously, this is old information. That's confidential information. You can't tell world. Anybody, right? But now it's in the headlines of all the newspapers and everybody knows about it. It's no longer confidential information. So extreme example, but absolutely. What about, I think of Route 53. So I used to sell property in Mundelein, Liberty, Vernon Hills. Route 53 is supposed to go right through the center there, right behind Mundelein High School where I went to school. There's a big path of property. That's not confidential at all. So if you're the seller and you have, if I'm going to represent the seller and there's a swath of land, it's not confidential. That's public information. So even if a buyer comes in and doesn't know what that is, it's not confidential. So maybe not the best example, but that you are right on, Daryl, with if the information becomes public, then it's no longer confidential. All right, moving on to stigmatized properties. So you hit one of them, Daryl. What else are stigmatized properties? Anybody else want to jump in with what could be a stigma?
Murder.
Murder, suicide, yeah. Ghosts, we heard that one. Those are the usual answers. And of course, it could be a meth home, meth lab in the house, that kind of thing, stigmatized. So do you have an obligation as an agent to disclose stigmatized properties?
No.
No.
Now let's pretend we're an attorney, give the attorney answer. It depends, right?
I think the meth one we do,
So
If
it
it was-
depends on what it is.
if
So-
it was a meth lab.
Right, so it depends on what the stories are. So if it's a meth lab, do you have an obligation as a listing agent to disclose that information? I'm
Yeah.
still gonna go with it depends. So it depends because what if we had a restoration company come in and remediate the entire house, removing all the drywall in the home, removing all the countertops, removing all the flooring, everything needs to be done because meth homes are a disaster because meth, in case you don't know, permeates the pores in the home. So the drywall, it's not on the surface, it permeates the drywall. It doesn't just cover the countertops, it permeates the countertops. Same with the carpeting and flooring and all these things. So all surfaces have to be removed. So let's just say, an extreme example, that all of that was remediated. Now, is there still an issue with the meth lab? If you can realistically, in your mind, say, yeah, they came in and did absolutely everything, then technically it's no longer affected by meth and you wouldn't need to disclose that. But in most cases, you're not gonna get that far. Lindsay?
Oh, I was just listening to what you were saying.
Okay.
Sorry, I had myself unmuted. I was
That's right, no worries.
absorbing.
So yeah, someone else?
What about health issues like AIDS or something like that?
Excellent, because that's the next one up. That's like I told you what to say. So murder, suicide, AIDS. So absolutely no requirement. So the law would say, and I'm not an attorney, the law would say no course of action can come against an agent for failure to disclose. So, we live in Illinois, people can sue people for any reason at all. So the lawsuit could be filed against you. In theory, the lawsuit should be thrown out. So HIV/AIDS is a great example, especially with COVID going on right now, because these are extremely different types of diseases. HIV/AIDS is transmitted only through fluid contact between people. So I'm going to say it's impossible. There's an asterisk because that word always scares me. It's impossible for someone who died of HIV/AIDS in the home for that disease to be transmitted to someone a week, a month, 2 months, a year later to someone that comes in and buys a property. There's no fluid transmission. But now COVID's a new thing, right? So COVID comes into play. COVID can be transmitted through contact of surfaces. And I would argue they're still trying to figure out exactly how long it lives on what kinds of surfaces. And I know they've done lots of tests, and I'm no expert in this, but let's just say if somebody was ill in the house with COVID on June 23rd and they're closing on the property June 24th, could that potential new buyer come in on the 24th after closing and touch something and then get it? I would say that's potentially, with what we know today, possible. So is there disclosure needed? Yes, I think there is. I would argue if you're the listing agent closing on that property with that kind of a scenario, you need to have a conversation with your sellers and the attorney for the attorney to give the sellers legal advice as to what sort of disclosure should be made in that property because of that situation. In my opinion, not an attorney, there should be a disclosure. There should be, it should be made known that someone has been in the house the day before they had COVID, that was known to have it, as an example. But a murder-suicide, so take that back a little bit. Murder-suicide, no, there's no disclosure requirement. Why? Because it didn't affect the house. So I had walked into a property, I was showing property up in Gurnee. We walked in, and right at the front door as we're going in, as I'm undoing the lockbox, I saw some residue of some tape. And I could see that it said police, and it was about the size of a Band-Aid, actually just smaller than a Band-Aid. It said police, but it was gone. And I'm thinking, did someone, am I wrong going in this house? But it wasn't there. It looked like it had been removed. We went inside, I showed the property. Everything was clean inside the home, like brand new clean, which we've seen that since, but back 20 years ago, that was kind of an anomaly and it was a little odd. And I just kept looking through like, what was the police in this? What took place? I was running through my mind. We get back to the front door. I don't think we'd even stepped out of the front door yet. And the husband said to me, hey, Jim, what's that at the front door? And I played a little coy with him. And I said, well, what did you see? He's like, well, that tape, what was that? I said, well, I wasn't sure if you saw that or not. I hadn't seen, I didn't know what that was. Said, I'm guessing something happened in this house. I didn't want to taint your opinion of this house by calling your attention to that. Because as I walked through it, seeing it, I was wondering what was going on. He's like, yeah, so was I. The wife apparently had not noticed it, and she was, they were not interested in the home. We took 2 steps outside the front door. I locked the thing up. There's a guy walking up the driveway to us. It wasn't threatening. The guy walked up the driveway to us, and we kind of all looked at each other. And I think maybe stopped at the bottom. We were walking down the driveway, and he said, oh, you're going to buy the murder house. Oh, right? So that was where the murder-suicide had taken place. And then, of course, the light bulbs go off, and I knew exactly what house it was, but I wasn't aware that that was the house I was showing. I knew about the murder-suicide. I just didn't know the address and put that all together. The listing agent had no requirement to tell us about the murder-suicide in that home, and they didn't. And they had no requirement to, because the home was not affected by that instance. Yes, it's stigmatized, but the property itself had all been repaired or cleaned up or whatever needed to be done in there. There was no remaining issues with the house. Fair enough? That's my sales hook. If you've listened to my seller program, fair enough? All right, so lastly, stigmatized house, ghosts, demons, poltergeists, whatever. Same thing as the murder-suicide. There's no obligation to disclose this. However, I might argue if, and I don't know where I stand in this. I've seen things in this world that my brain can't quite wrap its head around. So I'm not sure where I stand with this, but let's imagine there was a poltergeist in the house and that's doing damage to the home, because apparently they can touch, I guess, I don't know the difference too well. But if they're doing damage to the home, then I think maybe you have a different position than you do if it's a ghost in the house, which is just walking around and not damaging the home, if that makes sense. So if you have a ghost in the house and stigmatized that way, you have no obligation to disclose. However, if I'm the listing agent, I'm going to have a conversation with the sellers about it and say, well, how well known is this as a haunted house? Oh, the whole neighborhood knows. Everybody knows. How likely is it the buyer coming in is going to know? Well, they may or may not, depends where they live. I might suggest to them, maybe we need to talk to legal counsel about the proper time to disclose this to a buyer. And I would argue that the best time to disclose that is during negotiations. Now, it may be earlier. What if this is the well-known haunted house? Everybody in the whole state, everybody, you know, knows it's a haunted house. Maybe that's a marketing technique. Haunted house for sale. So again, you're going to talk with your seller. So lots of scenarios. This is meant for conversation to give you different scenarios for you to think about. What lingering questions do we have on this slide? I stepped to the last one, of course. All right, timely present all offers. You have an obligation as an agent to timely present all offers. This is strict and important. I mean, not that anything else that we've said here is not important, but sometimes this gets lost a little bit. Your job as a real estate agent is to advise your clients. You're not a decision maker. You give your clients information, they make decisions. As long as those decisions and directions are legal, you need to follow them. If they're illegal, you know, discrimination and fair housing issues, that's a different story. You need to have a different conversation with them. But timely present all offers. Even if the property is under contract, even if you're about to close on the property and someone calls you up and says, hey, you know, I showed that property 3 months ago. I haven't looked it up on the MLS, but my client was really interested. We just wrote an offer on it. Your job is to say, great, send it over to me. Not, oh, too bad, we're about to close on it. You have an obligation to receive that information and find out. So then you walk in, get the clients, pull them aside. Hey, by the way, we've got an agent just called me up and said, you know, they got an offer. I told them to send it over to me. I realize your life's in a truck and you're about to move out of state or whatever, but you know, you're getting that sent over. That's your job. Your job is to get the information, present it to your client, get the direction for your client, and then respond from there. You go in and talk to the client says, yeah, well, we're going to close on it. Why don't we wait till we finish closing on this? And then we can call them back and let them know that it's already closed. Great, no problem with that. Good direction. All right, we fair in that? All right, commission rates disclosed. You have an obligation, affirmative obligation through state license law and through the code of ethics to make sure that the sellers are aware of both sides of the commission. So we can argue that the seller pays both commissions, the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, right? I can also argue, well, you know, really the buyer's paying for it because they're buying the house and the money's coming from them. So I don't care how you look at that. It's kind of a mixed, you know, catch-22 situation. But you have an obligation to let your sellers know, here's the full amount of the commission and here's the amount of that full amount that's going to be paid to the buyer's agent. So we are recording. I want to be careful here, but there are things out there in the MLS. There's this, I'm going to call it the minus fee, completely legal. There's no problem with that. I'm just going to broadly say, if you are unhappy with the commission that's being offered to you as a buyer's agent, you have a couple of options and a couple of ways for you to negotiate that commission with your buyer's permission. Your buyer's interest must come first. So let's use as a best example here, a foreclosed property, a HUD home. I bought one of those once many years ago. A HUD home in a system, I believe they're still offering a $1 commission, which is really zero, but we don't allow zero. So the buyer needs to pay the buyer's agent commission on those deals. And when you put the offer into your system, the commission is listed in there for the buyer's agent, which gets subtracted out of the amount offered so that they can see the net dollar amount to the HUD home. So HUD homes, if you're unhappy with the $1 that's going to be offered to you through your listing side, you need to have a conversation with your buyer about how we can handle that. And in this case, for a HUD home, they need to pay you that directly. If outside of HUD home, you're unhappy with the commission that's being offered to you, you are entitled to that opinion. You have a conversation with your client. If you have a buyer's agency agreement, that changes the picture even further. If your buyer's agency agreement says, I'm going to make up some numbers just for educational purposes here, I'm not suggesting these be the fees that you charge or give away that you offer. So $4,000. So if your buyer's agency agreement says I need to make $4,000 or more in a deal, and you pull up a property and it's $3,999, and if you are upset with that $1, you need to come to your client and say, hey, we've got the buyer agency agreement. There's a property in the market that looks great for you. It's got all the criteria of the property, but they're short in that $1 that we require here. So how would you like me to handle that? I can either, one, we can go back to the seller and ask through the listing agent if the seller's willing to raise the commission rate that dollar to whatever fee. Again, I'm just using this as an example and crazily for example purposes. Or if you'd like to pay that $1, that's fine as well. Or if you'd like to not see that home, that's a third option for you. But I want to make sure you know that there's a property that's of interest to you, but there's an issue with the commission that we've agreed upon. How would you like me to handle that? That's the conversation you have with it. All right,
Question.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, Jim. I've been noticing like some people offering $1 commission, like you said. Isn't that not really like fulfilling your obligation to the seller by offering a $1 commission? Because who's gonna want to work for that? And isn't that like that the listing person is just giving no one the opportunity to sell the property except himself?
So great point. So the listing agent would have a conversation with the seller at the listing appointment. And so in this example, let's say it's not a HUD home. Let's say it's a regular seller, and the seller says, I don't want to pay a buyer's agent fee, so we'll offer him the $1 as a minimum. So let's put it that way. It's a traditional transaction with a $1 buyer agency agreement, buyer's co-op compensation offer. If you are unhappy with that, you're going to have that same exact conversation with your buyer of, there's a property in the market. We have information, would love to show it to you, but buyer's agency agreement says it's going to be this dollar amount. How would you like to handle that? I think I missed your question. So,
well, I'm saying, isn't that not fully living up to your obligation in the best interest of the seller or the landlord or whatever? Because what agent is going to do anything for $1? Therefore, that solely puts it in the listing agent's hand that only he can really sell the property or rent the property.
Gotcha. So I agree with you 100% there. So right, this is in the listing agent's hand at this point. When they're in the listing appointment, they have to have that conversation. If the seller says $1 and I'm holding to the $1, the agent, my opinion, the agent should say, just so you know, this is how it typically works in real estate. This is how the MLS works. We offer a compensation. Typically, it's this dollar amount, or this is what my firm offers, or however you're going to work that. Typically was not a good word. So again, you guys can have better conversations on this than I can, because I haven't practiced real estate in a while. But you're going to have a conversation, explain to them what that inducement is, what that offer of compensation is to the buyer, and if they offer $1, how that might negatively impact them. So now you have a decision to make. If the seller says, that I get that, but I still want to just do $1 and we'll see what we get out of it. You have a decision. Do you want to not take that listing, which is an actual decision for you to make? I did turn away sellers. There were times when I was not comfortable with the seller, felt that he, she, and I, whatever, didn't get along well or whatever. And I said, you know what? I'm not sure I'm the right agent for you. I have another agent in my office that can help you out in those cases. In this case, you might just say, I'm not sure I'm the agent for you. I think you're going to need to go find another agent to help you with this, but I'm not your guy. That's not how I'm going to do it. That's fine. You can turn down clients. Yes, you have an obligation. You must let your client know, give them your best, honest advice, and be firm with them, be frank with them. And if they choose to, at that point, go forward with something that's outside of what you think is in their best interest or whatever, then you can walk away from it. Or you could take and say, all right, well, I'll go ahead and take this listing, but just understand that this is not the normal route. We'll see what we get, but I'm expecting we're gonna have buyers call us or buyers agents call us who are gonna wanna know what the real commission is, and are you gonna be negotiable? Because it sounds like you're not. So how do you want us to handle that commission question if it comes up? And they may say, well, then tell them they need to get the commission from their buyer. Okay, and if that's something you wanna do, then you could move forward and take that agreement and put it in the MLS and go forward.
Okay.
Oh, boy. I got really messed up here. Let's catch up. All right, other questions yet? Oh, boy. Almost there. All right, cooperation does not equal compensation. You must be aware of this. This is huge for you. So cooperation, you are obligated by the law and the code to cooperate with other agents and other licensed people. So if they have a real estate license, you must cooperate with them. So someone calls you up and says, hey, you know, I've got a real estate license, it's active, everything's good. You look it up on IDFPR, you find it is, but I'm not with a firm that's a part of the MLS. So I see that you've got a listing for sale in Crystal Lake. I'd like to go show that property. You can say, yep, come on over and show the property. No problem. Let them in. You must cooperate if everything lines up and is accurate. They close on the deal, their buyer buys the property, goes through the stuff, closes on the deal. If they're not in the MLS and if they didn't get from you an offer of compensation, you don't owe them the commission. Now, this is where Betsy Urbance, Illinois Realtors, and I have a little disagreement. She would argue that the listing office is entitled to the full commission amount in that point and could keep both halves. I have a little issue with that if you've told the seller that half of that commission was going to go to the buyer's agent and for getting the buyer, how do you logistically keep that? I don't have an answer for that portion. We're not going to go there because that's a legal question, and Betsy knows more than I know about legal stuff, but I have a little issue with that. So I would be cautious about keeping the full commission in that scenario. But what I want to make sure you guys know, so someone had asked earlier before we started recording, we talked a little bit about Rockford and showing property in Rockford. Let me just cover that briefly. So not just Rockford, but you go even to central Illinois and southern Illinois and other parts of Illinois, your real estate license is for Illinois. Technically, you can sell or buy, help your clients buy property throughout the entire state. Now, the code would argue and say, and the law agrees with, that you have to be knowledgeable in the area that you're working or make sure your clients are aware of your lack of knowledge to work in area. So if you know nothing about Quincy, Illinois, and that's a different MLS and whatever else, it doesn't have to be, just you know nothing about it, should you be working with buyers in that area? Possibly you could, but make sure your buyers know you don't know anything about Quincy, Illinois as an example. So Rockford's our example because that's the closest one for us. So I'm gonna use them as an example. So if an agent in Rockford lists a property for sale and is not in MRED, and again, a lot of those agents are also in MRED, I'd guess about a third, I don't know the exact number. So sometimes those properties are already in MRED. Let's say this property is not in MRED, it's only in the Rockford MLS. You find out about it, your client emails you information on it, you see the email, you click on the link, it takes you to that brokerage's site, you set up a showing, you go out there, show the property, sell the property, close on the property. They don't pay you a commission and they don't owe you a commission because there's no commission agreement. If it's not in your MLS that you're a part of, there's no offer of compensation to you. It's that simple. They're not going to pay you and they shouldn't pay you, frankly. Now, again, back to the Betsy argument, I argue the money should stay with the seller. Betsy argues the company could potentially keep it. Again, keeping that out. So cooperation and compensation are not the same thing. You must cooperate. You don't always have to compensate. So the point here is if you're going to show property, make sure that you pull it up in the MLS to make sure it's active, and the MLS meaning the one that you're a member of, which is probably MRED, Midwest Real Estate Data, and have a copy of it the day that you're showing it, and most importantly, the day that you sign the contract. You could argue the day of negotiation, but certainly the day of signing the contract. So the other side is if the compensation is going to change, the code requires that an agent, a listing agent, affirmatively notify all interested parties. So there's an obligation by listing agents, if the commission changes, to notify interested parties. I'm not exactly sure what interested parties means, but I know for sure that it means someone that showed the property today, yesterday, this week, maybe even last week. Those are interested parties. So if the commission's been changed, especially if it's reduced, and you're the listing agent and your seller changes the commission and lowers it, I don't know why they would if it hasn't been selling, why they lower their commission, but that's a different conversation. You have an obligation to pick up the phone or whatever, how you're ever going to contact these agents who have shown the property to make them aware, by the way, the seller has reduced the commission to whatever it is. I would argue you also have the obligation to tell them that the compensation is increased, should it have increased. And of course, you'll want to do that if it's an encouragement to get agents to write an offer on it. So, any questions on that? New advertising laws. So keep in mind the laws changed, and right now as we speak, Illinois Realtors is doing an update, giving an update on this. They are recording those sessions, and there are video sessions on the changes to the Real Estate License Law Act. You need to be aware of these changes. If you knew what they were previously, you certainly need to know what they are now. So now the law, there's a couple of pieces of it. Specifically, want to make sure you know is that your name must be equal to or smaller than your company name in advertisements. This is a big deal. There are lots of places where this is not happening. So old marketing signs, marketing pieces might have bad percentages. So your name might be larger than your firm name in some of those pieces. Those are illegal and no longer allowed. We can argue back to August 9th, but certainly January 1st, and certainly now, whatever we are, June 16th, 17th, those are not allowed. So be aware of the license law changes with regard to advertising, and especially that one there with the size of the name. The company name must be larger than your name. Now, of course, that brings up lots of other questions, which we don't all have answers to. IDFPR isn't sure they have all the answers to. What about if your logo is a part of your company name? Then does your logo count in the size? Is it now bigger than the name? There are lots of pieces of this that make this difficult to police. But I would argue there are many cases where this is clearly, obviously in violation. So be aware of that, those changes, and how you're going to deal with that. Antitrust in illegal tie-in arrangements. So I'm going to keep this really short. So be very careful about illegal tie-in arrangements. Antitrust, of course, in price fixing, go hand in hand, and we'll cover that in a second. But illegal tie-in arrangements, that's where you have to buy one product in order to buy another one. And lots of times that's not even illegal. Like a builder can say, you can buy this lot for sale, but only if you use us to build the home on it. So that's not illegal necessarily. There are some situations where that could be tweaked, that story could be tweaked to make it illegal, but it gets difficult quickly. So I'm not going to cover that much more than that. But if you come across a situation, again, I've been doing this 25 years and haven't heard of an illegal tie-in arrangement in real estate in that time frame. If you come across one, let me know. We'll get legal involved and we'll figure out what's going on there. But if they say in order to buy this, you have to buy that, that's a tie-in arrangement, whether it's legal or not, is a different story. So price fixing is a big, big deal. I want to make sure you guys are aware of this. Commission agreements, of course, you can't discuss amongst competitors. So be cautious of where you are when you have commission conversations. So it wasn't too long ago that two agents were doing, an agent was doing a broker open house. Another agent came into the broker open house. There was a conversation being had. My understanding, and I don't know that I know all the facts, my understanding were these were two agents from the same firm. They were discussing commission. Another agent came into the property, heard them discussing it, and thought this was a commission price fixing arrangement and filed a lawsuit against them, the firm, and the whole big thing. Eventually, this got resolved. The association, it wasn't Heartland, the association got dragged in. Finally, they got removed from it. It's a big deal. You should only have commission conversations in private. So inside your office, absolutely. You can talk with your managing broker. You can talk about commissions and what your company charges at your conferences, your sales meetings. Have a conversation with your managing broker, what you're allowed to charge and what your negotiation is and how much. You need to know all those things. But do not discuss it openly. When you're outside of your office walls or outside of a private area, I'd be very cautious for you to have a conversation, even if it's with your managing broker or another agent. Cautious. I didn't say it was illegal. I just want you to take caution. You are certainly allowed to get data and make independent business decisions. So as an example, you can certainly go look in the MLS and see what other firms are offering for co-op compensation. And then you in your firm with your managing broker, owner, or principal, or whoever, can decide what your firm's policy is on offering co-op compensation. Absolutely legal. You can get the information and then make a decision. You can't call your competition and say, hey, what are you guys giving away? What do you offer? What do you charge? Or what's going on? And then have a conversation. No. No. So think of the gas station. I love using this example. I think of Route 31 and 176 here in Crystal Lake. Two gas stations right across the street from each other. One's a Mobil, one's a Shell. Shell can look out the window, get their binoculars if they need them, look out, say, hey, Mobil's charging $2.19 for gas. We're going to charge $2.19 for gas. No problem. Mobil can look out their window. Hey, they're charging $2.20 for gas. We're going to charge $2.20 for gas. No problem. Mobil can't pick up the phone and call Shell and say, hey, what are you going to charge for gas today? Why don't we do $2.21? Why don't we do $2.18? Why don't we do $2.10? Doesn't matter the price. They can't have the conversation. You can't have the conversation. So that's my story. Boycotting, be very cautious of this. So this might come into play. I think of back 20 something years ago, we had a new firm come into play, into our marketplace, if you will, where I was selling real estate. And they had a different commission structure than what we were used to. And so there were 3 of us in the office, and we all said to each other, hey, did you see what XYZ is doing? And they said, yeah, I did. And all 3 of us kind of looked at each other like, oh my God, if we keep going this conversation, there could be a problem. Nothing happened. We all kind of just turned and blankly walked away without saying a word. But, you know, that wasn't a good place with where we could have been very quickly. So you can't conspire with your competition or even within your firm to put pressure on another firm. So even agents in your own office need to be cautious about boycotting another firm just because you don't like something they're doing, whether it's a commission rate or whatever it is, else it is. Be very cautious. In fact, don't do that. Whether it's actual damages or perceived damages, doesn't matter. It can, just the fact that you're doing it, whether they're harmed or not, is illegal. Blockbusting, steering, redlining, you need to be careful of all those things as well. I see we're running low on time. I think we're getting close, but I want to cover fair housing. I'm not going to make you recite all the protected classes, but of course, keep in mind there are federal protections, how to handle those hidden questions. What I want to make sure you realize, and especially for the new agents on this call, this meeting, think about how you're going to handle the question. And I'm going to say when someone asks you a question, not if. So mine happened kind of early on. I was showing, I think we were doing a walkthrough, a final walkthrough, and my client's father had come with, and he had looked out across the complex. It was a townhome. He looked out across the complex and he said, so what's the makeup of the neighborhood? And I think I know what he meant. I think he was asking a fair housing kind of question. And I was kind of stumbling with, oh boy, this is a bad position. What am I going to say? She jumped in and said, oh, Dad, stop it. People live everywhere. And I went, whoo, save me from having to try to answer that. What I want you to do is to think about how would you have answered that? Because someone's going to say something, someone's going to ask you the question, and maybe their intent isn't harmful. Maybe it's a fairly innocent question, but you need to be very careful in how you're going to answer that. And you know, maybe it's as simple as, well, you know, you're with a listing, because I did mostly listings, and they might say something that's discriminatory. You might say, well, everybody's agreeing to me, you know, they can afford the home or not afford the home. That's really what matters. I mean, in the end, you're moving away, so why should it even matter regardless of who's buying the home from you? And move on. Answer it and move on. You don't want to dwell on that question. There are some questions you want to dwell on, let them think about. That's not one of those questions. You answer it and you move on and you get past it. If they come back to it, now you have a dilemma on your hands. You have to come back to that same point earlier of, do I want this listing or do I not want this listing? Maybe remind them, maybe make it known, maybe come down firmly with, you know, that kind of a conversation is illegal. There are federal laws or antitrust laws or federal housing protection laws against this exact kind of situation. I'm not sure you really mean what you're saying, but I want to be really clear that I'm not going to be party to any of that. So if you're insistent on this kind of a transaction, I'm not going to be your agent. My firm's not going to be interested in this. We're going to have to find, you know, you're going to have to find someone else to represent you. Get firm with them if that's what it takes. Let them know. Don't accuse them, but you know, if that's what you mean, I would say it softly, kind of a backdoor route for, certainly this isn't what you mean, is what you're saying, but if you know that's really what they mean, then you need to think about, is this a deal that I really want? And it probably is not, if that's where they're going. So you know what they all are, it's on the next page, but additional may be added, source of income and others. So be careful where you're showing property. For instance, Cook County has source of income as a protected class, so you can't use their housing assistance programs, otherwise known as Section 8. I hate that term because it's so stigmatized. I don't even use Section 8, just fair housing program, or vouchers might even be better, assistance. So source of income, it could be alimony, child support, that as well. Whether it's a rental or a purchase, doesn't matter. It's protected. It can't be used against them. And in fact, I'd argue you probably shouldn't use that anywhere, frankly. It would be best practice to not, but it wouldn't necessarily be illegal in other places to do that. But I don't recommend it. Disparate impact and background checks. You need to be cautious. So what if a client suggests to you that, so what if you live in a college town, they have an apartment building and they say, hey, I don't want to rent to football players. Well, you and I know football players is not protected class, but we have to ask ourselves, is this a backdoor question for they don't want to rent to some segment of the population? So let's just say perhaps, I don't know the facts, let's say perhaps African Americans make up a larger percentage of football players than other sports. I don't know, I'm just guessing. Are they using this as a ruse to discriminate against African Americans? It could be. So I would follow that up, and I teach in my other classes of always follow up a question with a question, or always sometimes ask a second question. After you ask the first one, ask a deeper second one to get the real answer, because sometimes the first one's sort of an ancillary, sort of a reactionary answer. Ask a second one. So, so football players, that's interesting. So you mean if we brought your tenant that was from the baseball team or the soccer team or the golf team or the hockey team, those would be fine, just not football players. And they might say, yeah, right, just not football players. And then you'd follow up with, well, why not football players? Well, because I've rented football players in the past and they've always damaged the property, but none of the other sports teams have, so I've got it against football players. You know what, to me, that's legitimate. If he doesn't want a football player because he doesn't like football players, that might work for me. That might be an answer where I'm okay with it. I'd probably still come back to him and say, I get where you're coming from, but what I'd really rather do is that we look at the tenants themselves than the sports team they play for. I'm sure there are plenty of good football players on the team that aren't going to damage your property. So why don't we look at it that way? Would you be okay with that if we open it to everybody and we examine the tenants that come in instead of the team that they're on? And that's a place where you dwell and let them think about it. Is that okay with you? You hook them. They're probably going to say, oh yeah, all right, that would be fine. Now, if you think that he's just going along with he, she, whoever is going along with you just to play along, and now we're still going to use these discriminating factors for disqualifying them, that's a bigger issue. But assuming that on the front and he's being realistic and really he just doesn't like football players are not protected class. But the disparate impact portion is, what if I really wanted to use, or he wanted to use, football players as a reason to discriminate against African Americans? So if I ask him about those other sports, he says, well, I don't know, maybe, these other sports are fine, but now you get a picture of, oh, he's using the sports as a discrimination factor. You need to have a heart-to-heart with them and let them know, hey, by the way, this sounds like you're discriminating based on protected classes, less their sports. So I'm really concerned for you that you're, one, violating fair housing laws, but two, this would be something I could not be interested in or couldn't represent you. In fact, no agent could. So how about we do this, and you have a real heart-to-heart with them about the real way he should go about it. So I beat it up with some stories. I think that's the best way to tell that story, but make sure that what they're asking you is legitimate. So again, you might think football players is, well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with discriminating against football players. There might be a disparate impact, an ancillary reason behind it that you need to be careful of. Background checks, be careful with those as well. They've gotten more stringent. Cook County has made it much more difficult. I'm not going to have time to go through all that with you here, but be very cautious of that. You're almost better off now letting the landlord do their own background checks than you getting involved with it. So if you have questions on that, especially in Cook County, you need to really research that. Reach out to us. We can get our government affairs people involved to help you get the guidance you need for that. But background checks become a concern. The biggest part of background checks is to use relevant information where needed. So this is, again, typically used for a tenant qualifying program. So you've got a potential tenant and you pull a background check, you need to use relevant information. So if they had a crime that they committed many years ago, or even not it wasn't related to housing, you can't use that against them. If someone had a murder conviction 25 years ago, they did their time, everything's fine, they did everything and they're out, you can't use that against them to not provide them housing. They have rights too, and rights to live in housing. Now, if they had an eviction last year, well, that's a different story. That's directly related to housing, it's current. There's certainly a good reason to not allow them to rent from your landlord with a situation like that. So bankruptcy, how recent is it? If they were bankrupt 25 years ago and everything's been fine since, they've got good credit rating, well, then you can't hold that against them. But bankruptcy last year and they were evicted from a property, that's a problem. So be careful how you're using that. It needs to be relevant and timely. Testers are out looking for these things. I would argue easily that I've been tested a number of times, even in my 5.5 years of doing real estate. I was the only agent in my office that really did rentals. So, and that's where you're going to see more of the testing, but it can happen as well with sales of property too. So testers are paid to look for issues and can be monetarily awarded even if not harmed. So they are incentivized because they get paid to find problems. So be cautious. All right, with that, we are done with this segment. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. And more importantly, turn off the recorder.